Middleton Railway was built 250 years ago this year to move coal specifically from the coal pits down the line down to the river in the centre of Leeds. In the 1750s, the mines were taken over by the Brandlings, and they turned mining into a serious business where they were supplying Leeds with coal. This was the start of the Industrial Revolution, and there were already steam engines in the mills, etc. And these were requiring more and more coal to power them. And also people were coming to live in the towns, and they were requiring more and more coal. So there was huge demand on these pits to dig the coal out and get it to where it was wanted in the then town of Leeds as quickly as possible and in as big a quantity as possible. Prior to the railway being built, it would be moved on donkeys, mules, just in bags, in small quantities. The idea was to build a wagonway, which was the forerunner to the railway. And the idea was that they would build carts, like small wagons, with wheels on, and these would be pulled on a wooden wagonway into the centre of Leeds. The big problem they had was that a number of people owned the land between the pit and the river in the centre of Leeds. So to overcome this, Brandling went to the Houses of Parliament and asked for an Act of Parliament to allow him to cross this privately owned land. And this is where we got the first ever Act of Parliament to build a railway. I mean, we do not claim to be the very first wagonway in the world. There were others around and about. We claim to be the first railway to have an Act of Parliament to build a railway. When Brandling asked for his first Act of Parliament, he actually named in the Act of Parliament the price of the coal. In those days it was measured in corfs, and it was so many pence per corf for sale on the dockside on the river. What he was finding was that his costs were ever increasing, and he was finding it more and more difficult to produce the coal and sell it on the riverside at a profit, sticking to the price that he named in the Act of Parliament. And he did actually eventually have to go back to Parliament and ask for an increase in the price. To enable costs to be kept down, the actual horse had to be removed out of the equation. And the only way you could remove the horse out of the equation was to build a steam locomotive to replace the horse. And this is exactly what they did in Leeds. They went to a young engineer called Matthew Murray, and he was working in conjunction with somebody else called Fenton. And they produced a batch of 4 steam locomotives, which they sold to Brandling to work on the colliery railway. One blew up pretty quickly, and the other 3 went on. In the next few years, 2 more blew up, but one, called Salamanca, was known to have worked for a good number of years. We're not quite sure of the fate of that engine. We think it was eventually scrapped rather than blowing up. They could only manufacture cast iron rails, and cast iron rails were not very strong. So they had to keep the weight of the locomotive down so it was as light as it possibly could be. The lightweight locomotive was fine for the brittle cast iron rails, but it had no traction. Because it had very little traction, it couldn't pull them. So he had this brilliant idea of a rack and pinion. And on the side of the locomotive, the drive was a huge great cogwheel which interacted with cogs that he laid on the side of the rails. And by doing this, which he did successfully patent, he was able to pull quite large loads with a very small locomotive. Now these were the first 4 steam locomotives that were built to work and actually worked in a commercial environment and earned their keep. So I think this railway can be said to be responsible for the steam locomotive industry in Leeds, which went on, of course, to be steam and diesel locomotives produced in Leeds. But Leeds produced more locomotives than any other town or city in England. The line came to an end as a coal transporting line in around 1960s, when the National Coal Board was going around shutting the smaller pits down because they just weren't economic to keep going, and the line was closed to transport coal slightly before the actual pit closed. In the last few years the pit was serviced by road, but the railway remained here, and it was a group of railway enthusiasts from Leeds University, the Leeds University Transport Society, who saw the opportunity to run this railway as a working railway. And they negotiated and got possession of the line. They didn't actually buy it. It's very complicated how they came about it. But they had permission to run trains on the track, and various companies round about assisted them in giving them siding space. And they ran a daily freight service for, I think, 12 or 15 years, bringing raw materials, sheet steel, steel girders, from the goods yard down in Hunslet to the stockyards of these manufacturing companies. And often they would then take out the finished products by rail. When British Railways started to change the way they handled freight, these small one-off loads were encouraged to be road transported rather than rail transported, and this industry slowly declined. I think the finishing straw came when the motorway was built, and so much of this industry was just annihilated to make way for the motorway that all the business for the railway stopped. And then it was decided that maybe it could be turned into a tourist line instead. 38 years ago, the trust was formed. We have a hard core of 30-ish volunteers who come on a regular basis. Some like to work on the sort of engineering side where you can get nice and black, and others prefer this side, the white collar environment. And then we've got those who go between the two, so we can cater for all sorts of people. Oh, there's always work to be done. I mean, we could work here 8 days a week. In some respects, it's like having a giant toy box, which toy shall we play with today? But, seriously, there is an awful lot of work. And some of these locomotives that you're seeing here have been restored. And to restore a steam locomotive or do a 10-year overhaul on one, which we often do here, you're talking about 3 years hard work on a locomotive. When we renovate anything, we try and do it with the same skills that we used 200 years ago, or hand riveting and this sort of thing. And it gives you an idea of the hard graft that went into building railways in the early days. We're open to the public every weekend from Easter, and during August we open to the public and run trains on a Wednesday. The rest of the time, if we are open, it's because somebody's here, but we're not officially open to the public. The trains only run weekends. Diesel on a Saturday, steam on a Sunday as a rule.